There are cities that rise from the dust and others carved deep into stone. But Venice was born from water. Each morning as the mist curls over the lagoon, the city seems to hover between worlds, half dream, half memory. Its domes gleam like thoughts not yet fully awake, and its canals whisper softly, carrying stories too old for language. Yet before the cameras, before the postcards and the crowds that now flood its bridges, Venice was not a fantasy. It was an empire. For nearly 1,000 years, this fragile city ruled the sea. It owned no fields, no forests, no veins of gold or iron, only salt, wood, and will. From a handful of muddy islands, Venice built a network that stretched across the known world, from the ports of Egypt to the coasts of England, from Constantinople to the farthest edge of Asia. How did it happen? How could a city with nothing become the envy of kings? Maybe the secret lies not in what Venice possessed, but in what she lacked. Without land, she learned to move. Without walls, she learned to listen. Without certainty, she learned to trust the tides. Venice became a living lesson in resilience, proof that strength can be born of vulnerability, and that water, when embraced, can be stronger than stone. And tonight, as moonlight drifts across her quiet canals, the city still remembers. The reflections of her bridges shimmer like fragments of a forgotten age, when every ripple carried a whisper of faith, power, and purpose. So, let us drift back together, through fog, through memory, through the slow current of time, and listen to the story of the forgotten empire of Venice before the tourists ever arrived. When the Roman Empire collapsed, fear swept across the Italian plains like a cold wind. Cities that had stood for centuries were burned to the ground, and the fields that once fed nations turned to ash. From the north came the Lombards, fierce, relentless, and the people of the mainland fled in desperation, searching for a place the armies could never reach. They found it in the shallow waters of the Adriatic coast, a maze of reeds, mudflats, and shifting tides. It was not the kind of land anyone would choose to call home. The earth sank beneath their feet, the air was heavy with salt, and every rising tide threatened to erase what they built. Yet in that harsh emptiness, they discovered something beyond price: safety. No cavalry could charge through the marshes. No army could march across the waves. What seemed like exile became refuge. What seemed like a prison became a fortress. They drove wooden piles deep into the mud, built homes on stilts, and learned to live by the rhythm of the sea. They gathered on small islands, Torcello, Murano, Rialto, each one a fragment of the world they had lost. From fear they built community. From exile they rediscovered belonging. Over time, bridges connected the islands, canals replaced streets, and a new kind of life began, one entirely dependent on the water that both protected and defined them. The first Venetians did not see themselves as founders of a city. They were simply survivors. They fished, traded salt, and built boats that could glide where others could not follow. Each storm that tore through their fragile homes left behind a lesson: that endurance could be stronger than conquest, and that freedom could be built not from walls or weapons, but from faith and adaptability. And so, from the wreckage of empire, a new kind of civilization rose, not upon land, but upon trust in the tides. In the beginning, Venice had no kings, no castles, no thrones. There was no crown to wear, because the city itself was its ruler. The people who had fled to the lagoon carried nothing but memory, and among those memories was a hard-earned truth, the price of tyranny. They had seen what unchecked power could do to empires, how it corrupted, divided, and destroyed. So when the time came to choose a leader, they chose something different. They elected a man they called the doge, not a monarch, but a servant of the republic. His authority came not from birthright, but from trust. Around him a council of wise men was formed, drawn from Venice's most respected families. Together they built a system designed not for ambition but for balance, a web of laws and rituals so intricate that no single person could ever rule unchecked. It was a democracy of discipline, where every decision moved as carefully as the tide itself. Venice became a place where laws spoke louder than swords, and where trade mattered more than conquest. While kingdoms across Europe fought holy wars and dynastic feuds, the Venetians built their strength on quieter things: contracts, diplomacy, and patience. Every deal inked on parchment became another invisible wall protecting the city from chaos. Yet the Republic was no utopia. Power still rested with a small circle of merchant princes, shipowners, bankers, and traders who understood that commerce could shape nations as surely as armies. But unlike the nobles of the mainland, they ruled not from fortresses, but from counting houses and shipyards. Their weapons were compasses and ledgers. Their victories were measured in gold and goodwill. From this delicate design, half democracy, half oligarchy, Venice found stability. It was a city built not for conquest but for endurance. And as its people learned to govern themselves, they mastered a new kind of strategy, not of battlefields but of centuries, the art of outlasting everyone else. For centuries, Venice lived under the shadow of the greatest power on earth, Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. The emperors in Constantinople saw the Venetians as clever sailors and convenient allies, useful for guarding the Adriatic and carrying goods across the sea. In return, they granted the city protection, privileges, and access to trade. To Byzantium, Venice was a servant, loyal, small, and dependent. But the Venetians saw something else. They studied the empire that ruled them, its rituals, its politics, its flaws. They learned the language of the court, the art of diplomacy, and the quiet power of patience. While Constantinople was consumed by endless wars against Persia and the rise of Islam, Venice turned to what it knew best: trade. Ship by ship, deal by deal, it became the broker between East and West, the silent middleman through which gold, silk, and salt flowed. By the 10th century, Venetian ships crowded every harbor of the Mediterranean. Their hulls carried the wealth of empires: spices from the Levant, silk from China, salt from the Adriatic. The gold of Byzantium passed through Venetian hands, and what had begun as a favor became dependence. The master now relied on the servant. The relationship between the two cities grew tangled, half alliance, half rivalry. Venice adopted Byzantine art, ceremony, and splendor, yet behind its admiration lay quiet ambition. The Venetians loved Constantinople's beauty, but they wanted its trade. They respected its power, but they refused to bow to it. For generations the balance held, a fragile dance of mutual need and mutual deceit. Venetian envoys smiled as they bowed to the emperor, but behind the smiles they counted every coin, weighed every treaty, measured every ship sent. They were learning the craft of empire from the finest teacher the world had ever seen, and slowly preparing to surpass it. and in time they would. Through faith, through cunning, and through one extraordinary act, a theft that would give them both a saint and a symbol. Every empire needs a story to believe in, a myth to make its power feel inevitable. For Venice, that story began in the year 828, far from the lagoon, in the sun-baked city of Alexandria. Two Venetian merchants, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, were trading along the Egyptian coast when they learned that the relics of Saint Mark the Evangelist, one of the 4 authors of the Gospels, lay hidden there. To the Christians of the age, relics were not merely bones, they were bridges between heaven and earth. Possessing one meant divine favor, protection, legitimacy. The merchants knew what such a treasure could mean for their young republic. Venice had no royal bloodline, no sacred birthplace, no holy claim, but it could have a saint. And so, in a bold act of faith and cunning, they stole the relics from their shrine, concealing them beneath layers of pork to keep the Muslim guards from inspecting the cargo. When their ship reached home, the city poured to the docks to receive it, and a legend was born. St. Mark, they said, had once preached in these northern lands, and now, by the will of God, he had returned. The doge proclaimed him the new patron of Venice, replacing St. Theodore of Byzantium, a quiet yet unmistakable break from the empire that once ruled them. The message was clear. Venice now stood under its own divine protection. Soon the symbol of St. Mark, the winged lion, flew over every flag, every fortress, every ship. Its paw rested upon an open book inscribed Pax tibi Marte, Evangelista meus. Peace be upon you, Mark, my evangelist. It was faith and power woven together, a reminder that Venice's destiny was guided as much by the sacred as by strategy. From that day, the lion watched over the city. It guarded harbors, glared down from marble facades, and led fleets across the world's seas. To enemies, it was a warning. To Venetians, it was identity, the mark of a people who had stolen a saint, claimed his blessing, and turned it into empire. And beneath that lion's wings, Venice began to build what no other city ever had. A dominion made not of land, but of water, wood, and will. If the lion was the soul of Venice, then the arsenal was its beating heart. Behind tall brick walls on the city's eastern edge lay something the world had never seen, a factory of the sea. It was here that the Venetians mastered the craft that made them untouchable, building ships not one by one, but in an unbroken rhythm, as if from an assembly line centuries before the idea of industry was even born. Thousands worked there, carpenters, blacksmiths, rope makers, sail weavers, all moving in perfect coordination. The air rang with the hammering of nails, the crackle of burning pitch, the smell of salt and wood. From the forests of the Alps, timber floated downriver to the lagoon, where it was reborn as galleys, sleek, fast, and deadly. Each worker had a single task. One shaped planks, another forged bolts, another tied the ropes. And when all their efforts aligned, a new ship slipped into the water, ready for war or trade. By the 13th century, the arsenal could produce a fully armed galley in a single day, a miracle of organization unmatched anywhere in Europe. Foreign envoys who visited called it the workshop of the world. Within these walls, the Republic transformed wood into wealth, craft into power, and precision into dominance. Every nail, every rope, every sail belonged to the state, guarded as fiercely as gold. The ships that emerged were more than machines. They were symbols. Each galley carried the flag of St. Mark, the golden lion roaring against crimson, its paw upon a book in times of peace and a sword in times of war. When the fleet set sail, the lagoon itself seemed to tremble, the roll of drums, the chant of rowers, the synchronized heartbeat of empire. The arsenal gave Venice what no kingdom bound to land could ever have, mobility. While others fought for fields and borders, Venice fought for horizons. It ruled not by the weight of armies, but by the precision of its craft. From that discipline came confidence, the belief that the Republic and the sea were one. And so, every year, Venice renewed that ancient bond, not through conquest or prayer, but through a ritual unlike any other. A wedding between a city and the waves that gave it life. Every empire has its rituals, but none as beautiful or as symbolic as Venice's marriage to the sea. Each year, on Ascension Day, the doge would step aboard a magnificent golden barge called the Bucintoro, draped in crimson silk and gilded with carvings of angels and lions. Bells rang across the lagoon as gondolas and ships gathered in a dazzling procession. Drums thundered, choirs sang, and the people watched their leader sail toward the open Adriatic, to meet the sea that had given them life. At the mouth of the lagoon the doge would rise, holding a simple gold ring. Before him stretched the horizon, endless, silent, alive. He would drop the ring into the water and speak the words that defined Venice's very soul. We wed thee, O sea, as a sign of our everlasting dominion and union. It was a ceremony where faith and politics blended seamlessly. Outwardly it honored God, but beneath the prayer lay something older, almost pagan, a renewal of the ancient pact between the city and the waters that sustained it. Each year the doge pledged loyalty to the sea, and in return the sea promised abundance, protection, and power. To the people, this was more than spectacle, it was reassurance. It reminded them that their survival rested not on fortresses or armies, but on balance, the delicate harmony between humanity and the tides. They knew that the same waves that carried their ships to glory could also swallow them whole. Mastery of the sea was never about conquest, it was coexistence. Through the centuries, the sposalizio del mare, the wedding of the sea, became the heartbeat of Venice's year. It was repeated generation after generation, a performance of destiny so profound that even foreign envoys stood in awe. They understood that this was not mere ceremony, but philosophy, a declaration that the Venetians were chosen not by land or lineage, but by water itself. And yet, for all their reverence, the Venetians were never naive. They loved the sea, but they did not trust it blindly. They knew that faith alone could not keep their ships afloat. Soon, one man, old, blind, and brilliant, would remind them that the sea could be mastered not by prayer, but by strategy. By the year 1202, Venice stood at the height of its power. Its shipyards thundered with hammers, its merchants ruled the trade routes, and its treasury gleamed with the gold of 3 continents. So when the knights of Western Europe came seeking ships for the Fourth Crusade, Venice agreed to build them a fleet for a price. The deal was grand, the payment immense. But when the Crusaders arrived, they could not pay what they owed. That was when the city's ruler, Doge Enrico Dandolo, stepped forward. He was more than 80 years old and completely blind, yet his mind was sharper than any blade aboard his ships. He offered the Crusaders a bargain. If they could not pay in silver, they would pay in service, by helping Venice seize the rebellious city of Zara, a Christian rival on the Dalmatian coast. The Crusaders hesitated. To attack fellow Christians seemed unthinkable, but Dandolo, calm and certain, told them, God will understand. And so, instead of sailing for Jerusalem, they sailed for conquest. Zara fell, and Venice's debt was settled, but Dandolo's true goal lay farther east. His gaze turned toward Constantinople, the glittering queen of cities. For centuries, Venice had served Byzantium. Now the blind doge meant to surpass it. With cunning diplomacy and quiet manipulation, he redirected the Crusaders toward the Golden Capital, convincing them that their destiny and fortune waited there. In 1204, the crusading army carried by Venetian ships stormed Constantinople. The richest city in the world burned for 3 days. Palaces were looted, relics stolen, cathedrals stripped of gold. And when the smoke cleared, it was Venice that held the lion's share of the spoils. On the steps of Hagia Sophia, the blind doge stood as the banners of St. Mark were raised above the conquered city. The servant had become the master. Dandolo would die there a year later, buried amid the ruins of the empire he had helped destroy. To some, he was a genius, to others, a traitor. But all agreed on one truth. He had changed the course of history. Under his rule, Venice proved that it was not merely a city of merchants, but a power capable of shaping empires. The fall of Constantinople in 1204 was not merely the end of a city, it was the unmasking of an age. When the crusading army breached those legendary walls, the world looked on in disbelief. The Queen of Cities, heart of the Eastern Empire, bridge between Europe and Asia, It was not taken by heathens but by fellow Christians. And leading them in spirit and in ship was Venice. For 3 days and nights Constantinople burned. Fire crawled up its domes, smoke swallowed the sea, and the cries of priests echoed through the marble streets. Treasures that had stood untouched for 1,000 years, relics, icons, chalices of gold, were ripped from altars and loaded onto Venetian galleys. Even the great bronze horses that once crowned the hippodrome were pried from their pedestals and carried across the sea to adorn St. Mark's Basilica, where they still stand today. Silent witnesses to the most profitable betrayal in history. To the world, it was a crusade gone astray. To Venice, it was strategy perfected. The Republic had gained more than riches, it had gained control. Its merchants now ruled the trade routes of the Aegean. Its fleets claimed islands and harbours from Crete to Cyprus, and its influence spread across the sea like a rising tide. The Eastern Roman Empire, once the master of the Mediterranean, now depended on the goodwill of a city built on wooden stakes and salt water. But Venice did not conquer to rule, it conquered to connect. It sought not kingdoms but harbours, not crowns but contracts. Each new possession became a link in an unbroken chain of trade, a network of ports and privileges binding the sea together under the lion's banner. And though many called it betrayal, others saw brilliance. Venice had turned faith into fortune, devotion into diplomacy, and war into commerce. When the Doge's fleet returned home, the bells of St. Mark rang without rest. The churches shimmered with new gold, the people cheered, and the winged lion of Venice, that symbol of a stolen saint, flew higher and prouder than ever. Yet every empire built on cunning carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. The web Venice had spun across the sea was vast, dazzling and delicate, held together not by conquest, but by trust, and trust is a fragile thing. From this triumph would rise something entirely new, a maritime empire that would dazzle the world, and in time drift toward its own slow, glittering fall. From the ashes of Byzantium, Venice built something remarkable, an empire without a continent. They called it Stato da Mar, the state of the sea. It was not a realm of land to be ruled, but a web to be sustained, a living network of ports, islands, and trade stations stretched across the Mediterranean like threads of silk. From the Dalmatian coast to Crete, from the Ionian Islands to Cyprus, the Lion of St. Mark now ruled not by walls or borders, but by tides. Every harbour became a piece of the Republic's grand design. In Crete, Venetian governors oversaw the flow of grain and wine. In Cyprus, merchants traded sugar and silk. In the ports of Greece, shipwrights shaped hulls, loaded spices, and mended sails. These were not colonies as later empires would know them. They were arteries of commerce, each pulsing with the lifeblood of trade. Venice's genius was never domination, but connection. The Republic did not demand obedience, it demanded reliability. If the ships sailed, if the market stayed open, if the coin continued to flow, peace endured. Venetian officials worked with local rulers, marrying diplomacy with discipline. Wherever a Venetian mast rose above a harbour, order followed, not through fear, but through the quiet rhythm of routine. The Stato da Mar became the maritime spine of the Republic's wealth. Gold flowed back into the lagoon, funding the cathedrals, paintings, and the ever-expanding arsenal. And though Venice's dominion stretched for thousands of miles, its rule remained strangely light, a web more than a wall, woven from trade rather than conquest. Travellers marvelled at it. How could a single city floating on water govern a realm that spanned seas? The answer was simple. The sea itself was Venice's road, its defence, its identity. The Republic was not bound by borders, no, it was bound by the tide, and among all who carried Venice's name across the waves, one would journey farther than any other, to the farthest edge of the known world, where the maps ended and legend began. His name would make Venice not just a power of the sea, but a symbol of exploration itself. In the year 1271, a young Venetian named Marco Polo set sail with his father and uncle on a voyage that would echo through centuries. They were merchants, not crusaders or conquerors, but what they sought was just as bold, the edge of the known world. Their ships slipped from the Adriatic into the great unknown, bound for the east, a place where silk shimmered like sunlight and spices carried the scent of paradise. For nearly 24 years, the Polos journeyed across deserts and mountains through Persia, Central Asia, and along the mighty rivers of China. At the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who ruled half the world, Marco became both envoy and observer. He saw cities grander than any in Europe, roads that stretched farther than any Roman dream, markets overflowing with goods Venice had only traded second-hand. Through his eyes, the East ceased to be legend and became geography. When Marco Polo returned to Venice in 1295, both he and his city had changed. Captured soon after during a war with Genoa, he shared his tales from prison with a fellow inmate, a writer named Rustichello. Those stories became the Travels of Marco Polo, a book that turned myth into map, rumor into revelation. Through his words, Europe first heard of Japan, of paper money, of coal, of cities glowing at night under glass lamps. To skeptics, he was a liar. To dreamers, a prophet. For Venice, his legacy was more than wonder. It was direction. His tales hinted at vast new routes and riches waiting beyond the horizon. The idea that the world was wider, richer, endlessly connected, that was the very essence of Venice itself. A city born from fear had become a civilization of curiosity. Marco Polo's story reminded his people that water was never a wall. It was a bridge. And while his journey opened the world to Venice, a new challenge was already rising from across the waves. In the west, another maritime republic was preparing to test the lion's strength, a rival whose oars beat to the rhythm of ambition. The time had come for Venice and Genoa to meet on the sea, not as traders, but as enemies. For more than a century, two cities stared at each other across the sea, Venice and Genoa. Both were republics, both were merchant powers, both ruled the Mediterranean like mirrored reflections of ambition. They traded the same spices, wooed the same kings, and chased the same dreams. But the sea was too small for two lions. Sooner or later, one would have to fall. In 1378, rivalry turned to war, a brutal struggle remembered by a single word, Chioggia. The Genoese struck first, swift and merciless. Their fleet breached the Venetian lagoon, seized the port of Chioggia itself, and for the first time in centuries, Venice faced the impossible, invasion. Panic spread through the canals. The arsenal fell silent. The city that had always ruled the waves now feared being swallowed by them. But Venice had never been a city that surrendered. Under Admiral Vettor Pisani and the aging doge Andrea Contarini, the Republic rallied. Every man of fighting age was called to arms. Every workshop in the arsenal blazed through the night, forging weapons, masts, and hope. Even the nobles gave up their fortunes for the cause. The doge himself, white-haired, frail but unyielding, laboured beside the shipwrights, hauling ropes and shouting orders as if youth had returned to his voice. The Venetian fleet struck back, trapping the Genoese in the very harbour they had taken. For months battle raged among the narrow channels, oars splintering, cannons thundering, men fighting hand to hand on blood-slick decks. In June of 1380, the Genoese surrendered. Venice had won, barely. The victory came at a terrible price, ships lost, coffers emptied, and thousands dead. But from that near ruin, the Republic gained something it had never truly known before: humility. From that day, Venice stopped seeing herself as invincible. She turned inward, rebuilding, fortifying, and tempering ambition with caution. Out of the fires of Chioggia, a stronger, wiser republic emerged. Its pride cooled, but its resolve sharpened like steel. Genoa would never again threaten her throne upon the sea. The war had taught Venice a bitter truth. The ocean that gave her power could just as easily take it away. So she turned her focus to what she could control: trade, diplomacy, and wealth, crafting a new kind of empire, not of conquest, but of commerce. By the dawn of the 15th century, Venice was the richest city in Europe, a gleaming jewel balanced between east and west. Its markets overflowed with colour and scent: silk from China, carpets from Persia, glass from Egypt, pepper and cinnamon from India, nutmeg from islands half the world away. The air itself seemed heavy with the perfume of distant lands. Gold was not merely wealth here, it was atmosphere. Around the Rialto, the heart of the Republic's commerce, the sound of trade filled every narrow alley. Merchants shouted in half a dozen tongues. Greek sailors haggled with Arab spice dealers. Jewish bankers tallied coins beside Florentine cloth merchants. No other city on earth felt so alive, so worldly. Venice was not just a bridge between cultures. It was proof that trade could be peace, that commerce could achieve what faith and politics so often failed to do: connection. The great merchant dynasties, Mocenigo, Contarini, Dandolo, grew richer than kings. Their palaces rose from the lagoon like marble mirages, their facades glimmering with gold and reflection. Inside, walls bloomed with frescoes of saints, sailors, and lovers beneath skies painted in lapis blue. Beauty itself had become the Republic's second currency, and Venice spent it as freely as gold. The arsenal roared again, no longer to build war galleys, but merchant fleets bound for every corner of the known world. Each voyage was a wager of risk and riches, each cargo a promise of fortune. And when the ships returned, they carried more than goods. They brought stories, knowledge, and the quiet conviction that the whole world somehow passed through this city of water. Yet beneath the glitter ran a subtle arrogance. Venice began to believe the sea was hers alone, that the tides bent to her will. But change was already stirring beyond the horizon. To the west, new nations were learning to sail farther, faster, to find routes that bypassed the Mediterranean altogether. Still, for this radiant century, Venice reigned unchallenged, mistress of spices and silk, of art and balance, of wealth so vast it seemed eternal. Her merchants had conquered without armies, ruled without crowns, and dreamed without restraint. But empires built on motion must keep moving, or sink. And soon Venice would begin to turn her gaze inward, toward the solid heart of Italy, seeking to anchor what could no longer float forever. For centuries, Venice had defined herself by what she was not. She was not a kingdom of soil or stone. She was not bound by borders or ruled by harvests. Her empire was built on water, a realm of wind, tide, and will. But by the early 15th century, the world was changing, and with it, so too was her illusion of safety. The Republic's gaze turned inland, toward the terra firma, the fertile plains and walled towns of northern Italy. To her rulers, it no longer seemed the province of peasants and feudal lords, but a fortress waiting to be claimed. Land meant grain for her people, strongholds for her armies, and protection from the rising powers beyond the Alps. And so, the city that had once fled the mainland in fear now returned to conquer it. At first, the expansion felt almost peaceful. Towns like Padua, Verona, and Vicenza opened their gates willingly, weary of endless feuds between dukes and despots. Venice brought stability, order, fairness, and the promise of law. Roads were rebuilt, canals deepened, trade restored. For a time it seemed that the lagoon had finally embraced the land. But beneath that calm, something in Venice's spirit began to shift. The Republic, once fluid and free, started to harden. The same system that had thrived on the rhythm of the sea now had to contend with taxes, standing armies, and the politics of soil. The delicate balance between commerce and liberty, the dance which had made Venice so extraordinary, grew heavy with each new province inked onto her map. And yet, the terra firma gave birth to another kind of splendor. Wealth from the mainland flowed into art and architecture. Villas bloomed along the Brenta River, their gardens echoing the stillness of the lagoon. Venetian painters began to borrow from the land, the ochres of Verona, the greens of the Po Valley, grounding their luminous world of light and water in the warmth of the earth. Still, the change carried a quiet melancholy. Venice, once guided by the ebb and flow of the tide, now built walls and borders. The sea had taught her adaptability. The land demanded permanence. And permanence, as she would one day learn, is the most fragile illusion of all. For soon after she claimed the land began to claim her. Through mercenary wars, rival ambitions, and a tangle of politics that would drag the serene republic into a darker, more uncertain age. The more Venice anchored herself to the land, the more she was drawn into the storm that was Italy. The Renaissance had made the peninsula dazzling, but also perilous. Dozens of proud city-states, Milan, Florence, Naples, the Papal States, and now Venice, jostled for power like jewels competing for the same light. It was an age not of kings or crusaders, but of condottieri, mercenary captains, masters of strategy and betrayal, who sold war as others sold silk. For Venice, this world of contract and calculation felt strangely familiar. The Republic did not raise armies from passion or faith. She hired them with precision. Under her banner marched men like Bartolomeo Colleoni and Francesco Busoni, soldiers of fortune who fought for gold, not glory. From the safety of the lagoon, the city watched as they clashed across the plains of Lombardy, turning battle into business. Victories were negotiated, not earned. Wars were not crusades, they were investments. The condottieri brought Venice both triumph and unease. They expanded her reach deep into northern Italy, yet their loyalty shifted like the tides. A commander could fight for Venice one year and against her the next. For a republic built on order and discipline, relying on such men felt like gambling with fate. At home, the government grew ever more careful and ever more secretive. The Council of Ten, the silent guardians of the state, tightened their grip on power. Nothing escaped their notice: plots, whispers, alliances. They understood what history had taught so cruelly, that empires are not destroyed by enemies, but by ambition within. And so Venice continued her balancing act, gold against steel, intellect against instinct. Her armies marched across the terra firma, her fleets still ruled the sea. Yet something in her rhythm had changed. The republic that once moved with the grace of the tide now walked with the weight of the earth, slower, heavier, bound by politics. Still, from that weight grew beauty. Painters, sculptors, and musicians turned Venice's contradictions into art. While soldiers fought beyond her borders, the city itself became a sanctuary of creation, a place where music softened the sound of war. For if her soldiers defined her power, it was her spirit that defined her soul. A soul that would soon find its reflection in something small, black, and timeless: the gondola. No other city in the world is recognized by the shape of a single boat. Yet for Venice, the gondola became far more than a vessel. It became the reflection of her very soul. Sleek, silent, and impossibly elegant, the gondola embodied the city's essence: balance. It glided where others could not, slipping through canals so narrow that walls seemed to touch the water, turning corners as effortlessly as thought itself. In the early centuries, gondolas were not black. They shimmered with colour, painted in bright hues, trimmed with gold leaf, velvet cushions, and the crests of noble families. Each one was a work of art, a floating signature of identity. But as wealth grew and luxury threatened to divide the Republic, the government intervened. A decree ordered that all gondolas be painted black, the colour of modesty, equality, and reflection. And so the gondola became a paradox, beauty disguised in restraint. Its long, graceful curve echoed the silhouette of the city itself, while the metal prow, the ferro, with its 6 forward prongs and 1 backward, symbolized Venice's 6 districts and the Grand Canal that bound them together. Every inch of its design held meaning. Every movement was a poem written in wood and water. The gondolier, too, became part of the myth, part sailor, part philosopher. With a single oar, he moved 1,000 pounds of timber and history. His songs drifted through the mist like memory, echoing off marble facades and rippling across the night. For centuries, the gondolier was Venice's storyteller, guiding lovers, merchants, and nobles alike through a labyrinth that never needed maps. As time passed, the gondola ceased to be just a means of transport. It became a bridge between centuries, a living symbol of endurance. Even as sails gave way to steam, as empires rose and fell, and as the world's trade routes sailed past the Adriatic, the gondola remained unchanged. Its slow rhythm reminded Venice who she was, patient, graceful, eternal. And when night falls and the city drifts into silence, you can still hear the soft pulse of a single oar dipping into the canal, the heartbeat of centuries refusing to fade. Yet beneath that serenity, another kind of power moved unseen, not the elegance of art, but the discipline of fear. For Venice had learned that what swords could not protect, silence often could. Beneath the shimmer of art and music, Venice was a city of quiet vigilance. For all her beauty, she was also a place where whispers could vanish into the fog and never return. The Republic had survived not through freedom, but through control. Her leaders understood something few others did, that power wrapped in silence could outlast any empire built by war. At the heart of this system was the Council of 10, the unseen guardians of the Republic. They watched over everything, trade, justice, even private life. Letters were opened, reports written in invisible ink, names logged in ledgers of leather and dust. On the walls of the Doge's palace, carved lion heads, the Bosche di Leone, waited with open mouths to swallow anonymous accusations. Anyone could drop a secret within, and the council would investigate quietly. From this shadowed vigilance emerged what many called the Venetian Inquisition. Not the fiery spectacle of Spain's, but something colder. Trials held behind closed doors, verdicts whispered instead of announced. A man might be summoned at midnight and never return. No cries, no crowds, only the muffled sound of oars cutting across black water, carrying him toward the prisons of the Piombi or the Pozzi. Yet for all its darkness, the system worked. While kingdoms across Europe erupted in rebellion, Venice remained serene. There were no coups, no civil wars, no assassinated doges. Fear became order, silence became safety. The citizens learned discretion as a way of life, to speak softly, act gracefully, and never disturb the calm surface of their city. Venice had always lived by balance, and this was balance of another kind, between liberty and control, beauty and restraint. The same canals that reflected the stars at night also carried secrets in their depths. But even the most disciplined republic cannot silence time. Beyond the lagoon, the tides of history were shifting again, faster and farther than ever before. The Ottoman Empire was rising in the east. The Spanish and Portuguese were charting new worlds across the oceans, and soon Venice would face her final blaze of glory before the long, inevitable ebb. By the late 16th century, Venice's golden age had begun to fade. The sea that had once been her source of wealth and power now carried ships she did not command. Spanish galleons, Ottoman war fleets, vessels from nations she had never before feared. Yet even as her influence waned, the Republic refused to sink quietly beneath the tide. One last time she would rise, not for conquest or commerce, but for survival. In 1571, the Ottoman Empire swept across the Mediterranean, threatening the islands and ports that had long carried the Venetian flag. Cyprus, Crete, Corfu, all stood in danger. Venice, no longer strong enough to stand alone, joined a fragile alliance of Christian powers, Spain, the papacy, and several Italian states, united by a single, uneasy purpose: to halt the advance of the Crescent. It was an alliance born not of faith, but of fear. On October 7, 1571, the two greatest fleets of the age met in the Gulf of Lepanto. The dawn broke over a sea alive with banners, crosses on one side, crescents on the other. What followed was chaos made holy. Hundreds of galleys colliding, oars shattering, cannons thundering, the air thick with smoke and prayer. In the heart of the storm, Venetian Admiral Sebastiano Venier fought with the desperation of a man defending not just a fleet, but a civilization. When the battle ended, the Ottoman navy was broken. The Christian alliance had triumphed. Church bells rang for weeks across Europe. Painters immortalized the moment. Veronese and Tintoretto filled Venetian walls with visions of divine light cutting through darkness. To the world, it was proof that Venice still carried God's favor. But beneath the celebration, the Republic's leaders understood the truth. Lepanto was both miracle and farewell. The victory had cost fortunes, ships, and men. The sea, once Venice's great ally, and was no longer hers to command. The Mediterranean had become too small for the world that was coming. Beyond the horizon, new routes were being drawn across the Atlantic, around Africa, into the vast Pacific. The centers of power were shifting westward, beyond the reach of the Adriatic. And Venice, for all her mastery of the sea, was about to discover that the sea itself had moved on. History rarely ends in defeat. More often, it fades quietly, like the tide retreating from the shore. For Venice, that ebb began the moment Portuguese and Spanish sailors rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crossed the Atlantic. The discovery of new sea routes shattered the old world's map. The Mediterranean, once the pulsing heart of global trade, became a tranquil inland sea, and Venice, its proudest port, stood stranded at the edge of a new age. The spices that once filled her warehouses now unloaded in Lisbon and Seville. The silks and jewels that had made her rich passed directly into the hands of nations she had never needed to fear. For centuries, Venice had been the bridge between East and West. But now the world had learned to sail around her. The Republic tried to adapt. She turned her genius toward diplomacy, art, and the subtler forms of power. Her ambassadors became Europe's most skilled negotiators, her painters and architects its most admired. But her wealth, like sand or water, began to slip away. The lagoon that once reflected the glint of conquest now shimmered with something softer, sadder, the glow of remembrance. A civilization that had conquered the sea now found itself mastering reflection instead of reach. And yet, Venice did not fall. She endured, as she always had, with patience, grace, and quiet pride. Her streets filled not with merchants, but with poets, musicians, and philosophers. What she lost in trade, she gained in myth. Travelers came from across the world to see her fading beauty, not realizing they were witnessing a transformation, an empire slowly turning into a dream. The Venetians themselves understood. They spoke of the changing world as though it were the tide drawing back, revealing the bones of their greatness. But they did not despair. If they could no longer command the waves, they would command time by capturing it in color, sound, and stone. And so Venice learned to live differently, beautifully, deliberately, with a serene defiance that only she could master. The age of conquest was over. The age of contemplation had begun. And in that golden reflection, half glory, half farewell, the Republic found its final identity. A civilization growing luminous in its own decline. The 17th and 18th centuries were Venice's long afterglow, an age of decline wrapped in radiance. Her empire had faded, but the city herself had never looked more beautiful. Like the last ember of a dying fire, she glowed with warmth even as her strength waned. The palaces along the Grand Canal shimmered in the dusk, their reflections trembling across the water like memories refusing to fade. This was no longer the Venice of conquerors and merchants, but of painters, composers, and courtesans. Music drifted through her windows at night, the haunting melodies of Vivaldi, the laughter of masked dancers during carnival. Behind those masks, Venetians danced not to forget their decline, but to celebrate what still endured: grace, wit, and an unshakable sense of theatre. The Republic had lost her might, but she had perfected her performance. Visitors from across Europe, poets, nobles, dreamers, came to see her, drawn by her beauty and her melancholy. They wrote of a city suspended between heaven and water, where every street felt like a dream and every shadow carried a touch of loss. Venice was no longer a capital of trade, but a living masterpiece. Even her decay seemed intentional, as if the city herself had chosen to age with elegance. Her leaders ruled more by habit than power. The doge still donned his crimson robes, the great council still gathered beneath the golden mosaics of St. Mark's. But these gestures had become rituals of remembrance rather than rule. The Republic breathed slowly, like an old actor taking one final bow, aware the curtain was about to fall, yet unwilling to leave the stage. Venice was no longer a force in the world, but she remained its mirror. Her painters trapped light as if to hold back time. Her musicians turned longing into sound. Her architects carved fragility into stone. And so, while nations rose and fell, Venice endured, unchanged in her change, luminous in her loss. It was, in every sense, a golden dusk, that fleeting moment before night when everything seemed suspended between what was and what will never be again. But night always comes. And in 1797 it would arrive not as shadow, but as thunder, carried by a young general whose ambition would end 1,000 years of independence. By the spring of 1797, the quiet splendor of Venice had begun to tremble. Across Europe, revolutions burned like wildfires, and at their center stood a young French general whose name already carried the echo of destiny, Napoleon Bonaparte. His armies swept through Italy with the momentum of a new age, tearing down old empires city by city. And now his gaze turned toward the lagoon. Venice, once the proud heart of the Adriatic, was no longer feared, only admired, like a faded queen still clothed in beauty but stripped of power. Her fleet was gone, her empire dissolved, her treasury nearly empty. The city that had once defied both popes and emperors now stood alone, fragile and magnificent. The doge, Ludovico Manna, presided over a government as ceremonial as the masks of carnival. The lion of St. Mark still flew above the palace, but its roar had long since faded into a sigh. Napoleon understood this. He didn't need cannons or sieges to conquer Venice, only inevitability. His army camped just beyond the lagoon, its shadows stretching across the water like dusk. The Republic hesitated. For 1,000 years it had survived through patience, negotiation, and the art of bending without breaking. But this time there was no way to bend. On May 12, 1797, the Great Council gathered beneath the golden mosaics of St. Mark's for the last time. In solemn silence, the members voted to dissolve the Republic. A millennium of independence ended in a single afternoon. The Doge removed his crimson cap, placed it gently on the table, and whispered, "May all be for the best." Then he walked away quietly, like a man leaving a dream. That night, French troops entered the city. No battle, no resistance, only the hush of oars crossing the Grand Canal, the soft echo of boots on marble. The banners of the lion were lowered, replaced by the tricolour of France. And the city that had ruled the seas now belonged to the land. To many, it felt like death. But to Venice, it was something subtler, a transformation. Empires perish, but symbols endure. Even as her government crumbled, the spirit of the Republic lingered in her stones, her songs, her endless reflections. The sea that had once made her free now rose to claim her once more. And in that surrender, waked, quiet, dignified, complete, Venice did what she had always done best. She endured by letting go. If you sail across the Mediterranean today, you can still feel the breath of Venice, soft, persistent, unmistakable. In the harbours of Crete, the lion of St. Mark still stares out from weathered stone. In the fortresses of Cyprus, his wings are worn by wind but not forgotten. Along the Dalmatian coast, bell towers and arches rise from towns that once moved to the rhythm of the lagoon. Even far inland, where the sea exists only in memory, Venetian bridges, plazas and windows whisper of a time when a city of water ruled the land. Venice's empire is gone, but its traces remain, not in conquest, but in connection. Her legacy was never about domination, it was about exchange. Under her sails, worlds met and mingled. Her architects learned from Byzantium, her merchants from Arabia, her artists from every shore the tide could reach. And in return, Venice offered the world a vision of balance. That strength could live within grace, that authority could exist without cruelty, and that civilization could float without roots, like a reflection upon still water. Walk her streets today or drift through her canals and you'll feel that strange equilibrium, the sense that the city is both awake and dreaming. Every stone holds a century, every ripple carries an echo, the air tastes of salt and time and something unspoken. Venice no longer commands fleets or shapes empires, yet she still rules through memory. Because Venice is not a place you visit. She's an experience that lingers. Long after you leave, she stays with you, in the shimmer of moonlight on water, in the hush of footsteps across marble, in that quiet, impossible feeling of standing somewhere between the world and its reflection. The Lion of St. Mark no longer guards an empire, but his shadow still stretches across the sea, not as a mark of conquest, but as a reminder that what fades can still endure. Empires fall, cities sink, but memory, if it is loved enough, floats. And perhaps that is Venice's final lesson, that beauty is not what resists time, but what embraces it. Thank you for drifting with us through the forgotten empire of Venice, the city born of water, faith, and endurance. This is Lunora, where history sleeps softly beneath the stars.